Welcome back to the Friends on Horses podcast. If you're like me, a curious horse nerd, this is your spot. We've got everyone from equine geneticists to nutritionists to top level riders and even individuals who've been on epic adventures. So if you want to be inspired, learn a little bit, this is your spot. This is your pod. Enjoy the show. Okay. Welcome back to the Friends on Horses podcast, and I'm here with one of my favorite humans, which is why I'm probably smiling a lot right now. I'm with Annika McGivern. She is a certified mental performance consultant. Did I get that right, Annika?
I sure did.
Excellent.
Nailed it.
And Annika and I traveled together for the better part of 2 years, working with horses and riders in a whole bunch of different disciplines. Obviously, me covering the horse psychology and biomechanics end of things, and Annika covering the rider's psychology, which has been, oh my God, I have learned so much from Annika. I am using all the time, and I cannot wait to share that with the rest of you. So, welcome, Annika.
Thank you. It's so nice to be back together chatting. We were just saying before we started how much we missed these conversations. So, yeah, really, really great to be back and talking more about this really interesting place where our expertise meets, right? Oh my goodness, I've learned so much from you as well. And hopefully, we'll be back on the road at some point in the future, all things coming into alignment.
I feel like it would not be a possibility for it to not happen.
So, stay tuned, everyone.
Stay tuned. Exactly. So, maybe I'm thinking about something that everyone can kind of relate to here. This is something that I see with my clients a lot, and I think it's a good starting place. Everyone has had that ride where they feel like there's this ping ponging of emotions happening between the horse and the rider. Let's say the horse gets tense, the rider responds with tension, and then the horse ping pongs off of that. And it's just like this cycle that horse and rider get into. And I thought this could be a good starting point because there are some really practical things that you can do. And it also shows how powerful our own mental skills can be in problem solving and improving our ride and our horse's performance and our experience. Do you have a take on, from your perspective, what's happening there and some practical things that people can do with that?
Yes. So, what you're describing there through the lens of psychology and how that impacts performance is really how closely connected the human's nervous system is to the horse's nervous system. For anyone who's not familiar with the term nervous system, it's a term that's used to describe the internal system in our bodies that manages our fear response, amongst many other things. The nervous system has many jobs, but the one we're going to focus on today is its job in controlling whether or not we essentially get scared in response to either real threats or perceived threats. And what I find really cool is that our nervous system and that of the horse are actually quite similar. We've got those common ancestors way back somewhere. That means that in just kind of a basic functional way, our nervous systems are really similar. And as a result, our nervous systems actually interact in this really interesting way. So, the best way I always try to describe this is, can you think of someone, no need to name names, but can you think of someone who typically, when you come into their presence, they tend to be a more stressed human being. And so, as a result, when you're around them, you feel stressed, even if that stress isn't really yours.
100%. I feel like everyone has that friend or has that person that boards their horse at their stable or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good example of how someone else's nervous system state can actually have an immediate impact on our nervous system. So it's like our nervous system in that moment is reacting to the stress of the other person's nervous system, even though we may not actually be stressed about anything in that moment. Another great example of this is how if you're with someone and that person suddenly gets scared, you will often have an associated startle response that comes from that person's startle. There's a really hilarious viral set of videos where one person would play a prank on another person. They'd set up a video and then suddenly point at a corner where nothing's there and start screaming and running away and trying to take cover. And the person who sadly was having the prank played on them would immediately go into the same panic response, even though they didn't actually see anything because there's nothing there. But their nervous system takes the signal from the behavior of the other person, right? And goes into a full fear panic response. So our nervous systems are very sensitive to those of the creatures around us, human and animal. And there's some research and thoughts that suggest that because horses are so, like, actually so physically large and they have really big hearts, that can actually increase the impact that their nervous system would have on us as relative, say, to like a dog's.
Hmm.
So basically, to summarize that, our internal state impacts that of the horse, and the internal state of the horse will impact us. And any rider out there can probably relate to the feeling of when your horse suddenly spooks, your heart probably jumps into yours for a second. Right. And that part is really unavoidable. We're always going to have an initial, startle response, if you will, in response to a horse's spook or startle response.
Sure.
Where this can start to get really out of control is where the horse maybe starts with some initial tension, and then we get really tense in response to that. That then feeds and maybe amplifies the tension of the horse, which then feeds and amplifies our tension. And that can get us to a very unproductive and sometimes dangerous place pretty quickly.
Mhm. My last year of riding I was losing a lot of stability. So I was becoming a more nervous rider. And it's interesting for me because I'm a behaviorist. I'm very comfortable with horse behaviors, but I'm having this natural response because I'm not as stable in the saddle. And it took me a while to figure out that that's what was going on for me, but that's side story. We'll get back to ping ponging. So I would really notice that when I was in the saddle on my sensitive thoroughbred mare, she would go into that off the track headspace really quickly when I got on her. And that was 100% in response to me being nervous for my safety. My body's response to being a little bit less solid in the saddle. How I really figured that out is actually some techniques that I learned from you, Annika, while we were traveling together, working on some of my breathing techniques and getting my nervous system to relax. And as soon as I did that, I mean, I got the immediate response back from her where she just big breaths into her top line. All of a sudden, we have breaks, right? And I go, right, I know this. I know that horses can smell our fear and emotional states in our sweat. We know that horses read facial expressions and can feel tension in our bodies. This has all been scientifically proven. So obviously, me regulating my nervous system would immediately have such a positive impact on how she was feeling. And then all of a sudden, we were able to work through some stuff. So it was identifying where that was for me, putting a couple of skills into practice, and then I had a totally different ride. Identifying it, and there are things you can do to work on it, which I'm very curious to hear what some of those things are from you, Annika.
Yeah, it's a perfect example of how we as the rider can actually stop the cycle.
Yeah.
And it's through doing things like breathing, which we'll talk about in more depth in just a second. One thing I always like to say is a kind of an important reminder for us as the rider is that it is our job to be the regulating partner in these types of situations, simply because we're the only one who can consciously regulate. We can't say to a horse, just calm down and just don't worry so much, you're fine. We do say that to them. But of course, they don't have the same capacity to think about their thinking and change their internal state that we do. So that's an important thing to kind of recognize that, and it's important. I think it's also empowering to know that is our job, and that it is also possible. We can, through using some tools, change our internal state. And as your example perfectly illustrated, we often see an almost immediate response from the horse when we are successful in regulating our nervous system, which really highlights that they are actually really responding to our state in that moment. Without realizing how much of an influence our internal state is on the horse, we may wrongly assume that there's something else going on in the environment that is causing the horse to react that way. Or we've all thought this or heard this. We may just sort of think, oh, the horse is having a bad day. The horse is angry at me. There's a lot of different kind of wrong assumptions that we can make when we don't actually realize that our internal state can have such a powerful influence.
That is such an important thing to bring up because, as you know, I talk about trigger stacking a lot.
Yeah.
So, trigger stacking being, it's the morning, you're late for work, you spill your coffee on your white shirt, and then someone cuts you off in traffic, and then you get to work and you've got this big pile of work on your desk that you weren't expecting, and then you have to work late, and then you picked up the kids late from school, and then all of a sudden your husband or wife doesn't take the trash out and you explode because it's accumulating layers of stress
Hmm.
that contribute to what we call these maladaptive or bad behaviors. And
Hmm.
horses are the same. One thing that sometimes we struggle to identify is where we might be one of the triggers in the trigger stacking cake. So
Yeah.
what I'm hearing from you is that, hey, there's something quite powerful that we can do to reduce the potential for these horses to react in ways that don't work for us. And also there are ways that we can, when our horses are reacting, reduce their reaction just through some of these mental skills that you work through with your clients. Do I have that right?
Totally. Yeah. So let's dig into these practical tools. So you've already alluded to breathing, and that's always my favorite place to start. So let's start there. So there is an increasing body of research that shows that one of the quickest and most effective ways to regulate, and in this case, when we're saying regulate, we mean sort of calm and steady and de escalate our nervous system, is to breathe in a specific way. So, of course, we're all breathing all the time, or if we pass out. It's really about how we're breathing that is critical. Our breath is very closely linked to our nervous system. And when we go into a fear or a stress response, there's a whole bunch of things that sort of automatically happen. So, some of those things are that our heart rate will increase. We will get an increase in various hormones and neurotransmitters, things like adrenaline and cortisol that will kind of rush through the body. And we often experience those as maybe a jitteriness or kind of a strange tingling in the body or just a heightened feeling of anxiety.
Right.
Another kind of automatic reaction is that our breath will become shorter and faster. So, shorter means that the actual cycle of our breath is shorter. My inhale is shorter and my exhale is shorter. And that means I start to breathe more rapidly. The most extreme end of this would be hyperventilating, which hopefully no one listening has ever experienced. I don't think it's very fun. It often accompanies what we would describe as a panic attack. And that's kind of that extreme end of it. So we move towards that when we get into a stress response with our breath just becoming a little bit more that kind of rhythm, right? And that, interestingly, we now know further fuels the stress response. So as we breathe that way, it actually encourages a gland in our brain to produce more cortisol and more stress hormones. So it all kind of feeds us.
Hmm.
Now, what's really interesting about the breath is it's the only part of an otherwise fully automatic stress response that we can consciously control. So I can't say to my heart, beat faster, please. I can't say to my brain, downregulate the amount of adrenaline you're pumping into my system right now. But I can slow down and deepen my breath. And by doing that, we can start to reverse the cycle, kind of the chain of reactions or events that's happening in our nervous system. And we can actually help to activate the counter state to a stress response, which is essentially just one of calming and relaxation and a de escalation. So it's helping our body feel safe again.
Mhm.
So the key to this is full deep breaths where we actually pull the air all the way down into the bottom of our lungs and slowing down the rate of our breathing so that we get as close to possible as to about 6 breaths per minute. This seems to be what the research is showing is kind of optimal. Now, that isn't too important in terms of how many breaths am I taking per minute. what is important is that we figure out how to slow down the overall rate. So, one of my favorite ways to play around with this, and I would encourage anyone listening to actually physically try this as we're talking about it, is to actually take your hands and find your rib cage and see if you can find the bottom of your rib cage, so kind of that bottom rib on either side, and put your hands there. Then I want you to take a deep breath in through your nose and just notice what happens in your body as you do that. So you may have noticed your rib cage move outwards and forwards as you breathed in, or you may not have. If your ribs stayed still, that's a sign that the breath is a shorter breath or a more shallow breath that you just took and it kind of got trapped in the top part of your torso. And what we want to do is we want to pull the breath deeper. So this time, I want you to breathe in through your nose with your hands on your ribs and imagine the air bypassing the top of your chest, flowing down more into the bottom part of your chest where your hands are. And what you'll notice is if you can pull the breath deep enough that your rib cage will actually expand noticeably outward as you breathe in. To really think about that rib cage expanding, and then it will contract a little bit as you breathe out. So just try that a couple of times in, out. So you may have already felt a difference. So sometimes people feel this immediately where they'll be like, oh, I feel like slightly, but noticeably calmer or more relaxed or less stressed. And that's what's really interesting is that even just a couple breaths, doing it that way can actually immediately create a noticeable impact on our nervous system state. If you keep doing that for 5 to 10 breaths, you'll definitely notice a shift. So the challenge is to first off, like become a little bit more familiar with that style of breathing so that you can do it without having to think too hard about it. Okay. And then to try out actually breathing that way on a horse, which will require initially a feeling of like multitasking because you'll be like, oh, I'm not used to thinking about my breathing. I'm used to thinking about whatever, right? Like my horse's engagement or are they bending around my inside leg or those types of more technically focused questions. But the key is to just stick with it and intentionally bring in that awareness of your breathing consistently over a couple of rides. And then your brain actually really it integrates it into the picture of what you're thinking about when you're riding. And you'll find that you're able to kind of track your breathing and whether or not your horse is bending around your inside leg all at the same time.
This brings up we're moving a little bit away from the ping pong horse, but
Mm.
this makes me think about my clients who have some performance anxiety and how helpful this might be in the warm up ring, getting ready for the big show. Managing the nervous system is probably a very important part in a lot of the mental skills that you work with. Is that accurate?
Yeah. And actually, that dynamic that happens in the warm-up ring is kind of like a mini version of the ping pong that we're talking about. Maybe it doesn't escalate into major tension where things are scary and unsafe, but you're a little bit more tense and your wrist is a little bit more tense as a result. And so they feel a little behind your leg or a little stuck, or maybe you're not getting the same flow or rhythm that you want to or are used to. Maybe that's affecting your distance to the jump or the quality of your paces if you're warming up for dressage. And that can trickle into a feeling of something's off, something's not right, which can cause more stress and tension and lower confidence. And that can have interesting and challenging impacts then in our ability to kind of perform at our best at a competition. Breathing can be a really positive way to shift that cycle and get back to a place of more connection and focus and relaxation, which then allows you to access a better quality of ride.
That's wonderful. And again, please keep me on track because I find this so interesting. But it brings up another question. May I jump? May I just chuck a question at So that makes me go, okay, so we're regulating our nervous system, we're using our breathing. When we say concentration, so this is something that I feel like a lot of riders have different levels. Well, first off, kind of different definitions of what concentration is and what's needed and what's ideal when riding. So that might be a bit vague, but when you're talking about concentration or focus, what
Mhm.
are you talking about and what is the goal? Where are you wanting to get people to? What does that look or feel like?
So, focus in a performance context is what are we paying attention to? And there's all sorts of things that we can pay attention or could pay attention to, but there's a relatively short list of things that is actually helpful to pay attention to in a performance context. And understanding that can be a real benefit. Often, when we talk about it's sort of a horrible term, I love it, but when we talk about choking, which is when we feel like we really dropped the ball in terms of our performance as a result of pressure. So, like, we really don't perform to the same standard we're capable of at a competition or under pressure. That's often attributed to our focus shifting in a significant way. So, we're paying attention to different things than we are in a less pressurized environment. So at home, let's say training at home where there's no pressure to perform particularly well or have a good result or impress anybody, our focus tends to be more on the task at hand. So just like what's happening right now, how's is my feet connected or my hands following the movement? We may be just sort of focusing on the directions of our coach in the moment, or we may be focusing on improving the quality of the counter in the moment. And typically, that task at hand focus is quite helpful for performance because it helps us to be in the moment. And it's also a focus that reduces anxiety. When we're really focused on the task at hand, there doesn't tend to be a lot of anxiety associated with that. But we do know that. So, when we are in a performance context, often our focus shifts, and all of a sudden we're paying attention to, does this look good? We're paying attention to the external environment, the fact that we're at Thunderbird or an equivalent big venue that has a lot of maybe prestige and atmosphere around it. We may be thinking about not wanting to let specific people down. We may be thinking about the possibility of failure. Or we may be thinking about how we really, really want to win the class or achieve a certain score.
Yeah.
And so that is a different type of focus. We're no longer focused on the task at hand. We're focused on a whole bunch of kind of contextual factors that don't really have anything to do with what we're actually there to do, which is to write a course or write a test, right? And are incredibly distracting and often have a lot of emotion or anxiety connected to them.
Mm.
So there's, we could probably do a whole podcast on focus, and maybe we should, because it's actually
We
a really
will.
big topic. But the briefest way to answer your question is that when we're talking about focus, it's about what am I paying attention to? And there's a real skill associated with being able to direct your focus or choose what you're paying attention to in any given moment and knowing what to choose to pay attention to. Like what is actually helpful to focus on and what are the things that may be tempting to focus on, but that we actually want to learn to tune out because they are in no way related to or beneficial to our performance in the moment.
There's a lot of pieces, and initially, I wonder, hearing you talk about this, there's a lot of, like, reflection that needs to happen to go, "Well, what's impacting my focus?" Like,
Mhm.
maybe for me, it might be my safety because my hip is not stable anymore.
Yeah.
Maybe that's taking my focus away from my breathing and helping my off the track thoroughbred with her downward transition in the ways that I already know how to do.
Yeah.
So it's like pulling away from the skills that I already have because my focus is not in the location that would be most helpful to me. Do I kind of have that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's
Mm.
actually a great example of something that can mess with our focus that's not related to competition. It's the question, am I safe right now? That can be incredibly distracting, and it's a very common point of distraction in equestrian sport because a lot of us have the awareness that safety is not a guaranteed thing. In other words, there is a certain amount of risk associated with being on a horse, and we have all experienced or seen the crashes or the falls and the different things that can happen with horses. And so our brain, in a way, like legitimately, sometimes gets pretty distracted with this question of like, am I safe right now? The challenge with that, and this is one of the great ironies of being safe on a horse is that the more we question and doubt how safe we are on a horse, the more we focus on all the things that could potentially go wrong, the fall, the spook, the whatever, the more we worry about that, the more our nervous system gets tense and activated in response. And then we're right back to this ping pong thing that we're talking about, where we're actually potentially part of what's then making our horse more stressed and more potentially more reactive. And it can all become a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Totally. Like me having to ride my horse into the fence line because the stop did not happen. Right? And I know this because the next round that I did, that did not happen.
Yeah.
Once I recognized what was going on, I applied some practical tools, and then we did not have to hit the fence. So maybe this is a good place to kind of go back to a couple more of these tools. So we talked about breathing. So, yeah, taking our focus away from that fear place and that ping ponging. So, what are some other tools that you might use with a client to get them through these more challenging moments?
So, two of my favorite tools for directing focus are self talk and positive visualization. So, what that means is if we can focus ourselves through our self talk, so we can focus on thinking something specific, right? Like, I can do this, I have the tools. We can also self talk like a coach to help ourselves remember and access the skills and tools that we have. So we can say, okay, what do I need to do right now? I want to have a good downward transition. What do I need to do to make that happen? I'm breathing. I need to balance my weight. I need to connect in through my seat bone. I need to be clear in my aids. And so in that self-talk, it becomes very instructional and very supportive and very clear. And by focusing on those instructions, we not only help ourselves remember and access our skills, we also help ourselves feel calmer because as we're thinking through how to do this downward transition to the best of our ability, we're now no longer thinking about the horse spooking or taking off. So we can do that through self-talk, and we could also do it through positive visualization, which is picturing what we want to have happen. And in my opinion, we do not do this enough as riders, but what we do without realizing is a lot of negative visualization. We picture the bad thing happening. It's often a byproduct of our nervous system being activated or being in that stress response. And these images will just pop into our head in unbidden and in a way that often feels a little bit out of our control. So I have a good example of this that happened to me recently. I took the winter off of riding for a variety of factors. And so I had spent very little time on a horse for a number of months. And then when I got going again, I started riding in an arena where the year before I'd had an unexpected and relatively bad fall. Bad meaning my body got pretty banged up and I couldn't ride again for a few weeks. And it was significant, it's not just a fall off and pop back on kind of a fall. Interestingly, I had not ridden in that same arena since that fall because that horse that I fell off actually ended up being sold a couple of days later and I ended up leasing a different horse. So I had not ridden back in that arena. So I showed up at this barn and was riding a different horse. And didn't you know that as I was running around, this image kept popping into my head of the feeling. And remember, the visualization is both visual in that we see something, but it's also very sensory. And so we may actually sort of like feel something happen in our mind. And I kept getting this flat feeling of a horse taking off underneath of me, which is what had happened when I fell off this horse. We'd been walking on a loose terrain, and I think a bee stung him, to be honest, and he just like scooted and bucked, and off I went. And it was like my brain and body remembered that somehow. And it was obviously somehow associated with this arena where it had happened. And that visualization kept popping into my head. Now, as you can imagine, super unhelpful. It didn't make me feel particularly confident in the moment. In fact, I noticed I kind of an elevated stress response coming in and all sorts of other things. And so I had to use my breathing in that moment as a tool to help manage that. But I also had to actively choose positive visualization.
Mhm.
What that looked like is I had to go, okay, what do I want this horse to do right now? So I wanted to canter a 20-meter circle. I had to actually picture a calm, balanced canter where nothing happened. And we just canter because what my brain wanted to focus on was this idea that I would canter and then there would be some kind of an explosion.
Hmm.
And I drop the horse, which of course there's no actual evidence for that. It wasn't gonna happen. I had to be very intentional, and I had to picture what I wanted, and in this case, I just wanted a calm, boring, uneventful canter circle and a calm, boring, uneventful trot transition. Doing that helped me get through that initial fear response and canter a few circles, and then feeling that nothing happened helped reinforce my trust in myself and the horse, and that just had a positive building effect, and within a couple of rides, I wasn't getting any kind of a fear response anymore, and that visualization wasn't popping into my head anymore. So do you have any similar experiences with anything like that where you've had to choose to think about something different?
100%. And actually, so two things that I'm getting out of this. One is often people think about visualization techniques when they're thinking about having a mental performance consultant, but probably not totally sure what that looks like and why. And that's
Yeah.
a really good example, especially for riders. We all have a history of hitting the arena floor at some point in time, and it's hard not to recall that in your body, have that impact the horse. Interestingly, I hope she listens to this. I have a client who she's got a very sweet, spicy horse, and she gets into her nervous system about it. So we have this little exercise where I get her to picture that she is this old cowgirl and she has a name. I got her to choose her cowgirl name. And she's like, okay, you're going to picture you're this old cowgirl. Let's just call her Susan. You're Susan now. And you're on Betty. Your horse's name is Betty. And just so she pictures this completely different ride and this completely different horse. And probably 60-70% of the time, we have a different ride, you
Mhm,
know? And then I think it helps regulate her nervous system and
mhm,
also just picturing, visualizing what she's doing in a totally different setting,
mhm.
helps her feel relaxed and in control, and I think that that's something probably similar to what you're talking about. It can be quite powerful. Is that kind of align-ish?
Oh, totally. No, it's a great
Yeah.
example, actually, and I've had clients do similar things where they imagine that they are a rider that they really admire, someone that they see as really confident and skilled, and they
Mhm.
kind of imagine that they are that rider and embody that rider, and that can have a similar effect. Absolutely. It's perfectly in line with choosing what you're thinking about in order to occupy your focus in a positive way and
Mhm.
choosing something that is like calming and helpful for your nervous system. So, if we put those three things together, that this is where I've seen a rider's ability to break out of this ping pong cycle. So, what we want to be able to do is note the horse's tension and take that as possible feedback that we ourselves are tense, right? So it's almost like we want to look inward first. We want to check that off the list first as we're trying to figure out what's going on with our horse because it's just a good place to start. So if the horse is tense or exhibiting tension related behaviors like spooking or whatever, then what we want to do is, okay, I'm going to activate these tools and I'm going to see if it helps. And if it does, that's a really good sign that you, in some way, this ping pong effect has been influencing what's going on. I always say start with the breathing because it works quickly, and sometimes that's enough, and it just changes the dynamic and great. If you want to layer onto that, then you start with the breathing and you engage your self talk by asking yourself, okay, what do I want right now? Like, what's that immediate goal? And immediate being like a transition or a leg yield or this exact jump that I want to jump, like really kind of chunking it down to just the next small thing that you want to accomplish.
Uh-huh.
And then thinking about, okay, so what does a good transition or leg yield or jump look like? Can I build a clear picture in my mind of how I want that to look and feel?
Hmm.
And I'll give an example of this actually. The same horse that I've recently started riding, she's quite a sensitive little mare. And when I first started riding her, I found her to be extremely spooky. kind of like the type of like out of nowhere spooks. Like we're going around, all of a sudden, boom, like boom, or like 5 meters across the ring or whatever. Or she'd do the kind of like jump and stare.
Mhm.
And so there was one day where there was just a particular corner that she was doing this in. And so I just broke it down. I said, okay, all I want to do is trot through this corner, right? With as much relaxation and connection and focus as possible. So I really activated my breathing and I just pictured us trotting through the corner in the way that I wanted it to happen. And I shared this example because I think sometimes people don't realize how, on such a basic level, this can be used. It doesn't have to be anything fancy like a specific movement or a jump or whatever. It can just literally be like, what's the next thing I want to do? Okay, I want to trot through this corner. Okay, can I actually picture that? And it really does create this kind of sense of calm. It increases your belief in your ability to do that, even if it's something as simple as just have a nice smooth trot through the corner. And when you pair it with the breathing, it's really cool. And again, it's similar to your story. I saw an almost immediate response in the horse that I was on, and that she no longer spooked in the corner. Her attention increased a little bit, but it was a huge improvement from the previous attempts where she'd done a noticeable spook. And then I was able to build on that and get to the point where the corner was really smooth.
This actually brings me to something that I feel passionate about because I've seen this stuff work so well. One comment that I get when I talk to clients, and I'm like, you got to do this mental performance consultant stuff, man. You need to hire someone like Annika because it's so good. And they go, well, I really want to, but I don't think I'm good enough yet. And I mean, obviously, I feel like that's probably just a limiting thought because in your example, it was just about trotting through the corner. Now, can you imagine if in that at that foundation level of learning, if we're already using all of these tools and skills, how much farther you can get and how much more enjoyable the process will be as you're evolving into, a better and better rider. Is that something you can speak to? Is there an appropriate level that's an entry point or what are your thoughts on this, Annika?
Yeah, it's a really interesting example of what I would say is sort of a self-limiting belief or story. It sounds like maybe that individual or those individuals are setting up some kind of a reality in their own minds where they say, okay, I have to be I have to have a certain amount of experience, or I have to have ridden for a certain number of years, or I have to be riding at a certain level before I can make use of a mental performance consultant or learn from one or be able to learn. I'm not sure. We'd have to ask those individuals kind of more about their thinking, but it sounds like they're setting up this condition for themselves where they're saying, no, 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 I'm not, I have to be something that I'm not before I can access this. My belief is firmly that the earlier we start to learn these tools, the better. And there is absolutely no threshold for this learning. And it may be linked to maybe the fact that for a long time, it was only professional or very high level athletes who access this type of resource. That we may have sort of an unconscious association with mental performance consultants or sports psychology as being something that's more for elite athletes or high level athletes because that was the level of athlete that tended to access that resource for a long time. But that's a great example where we kind of need to update our beliefs and update our stories because whereas that may have been the case for a long time because it was such a limited resource for a long time, now that's really not the case. And there's so many more of us out there with this training. It's meant that the access to this type of training is way more broadly available. It would be kind of like saying, I have this baby horse to train, but I'm not going to hire a horse trainer until the baby horse just kind of like figures out how to walk trot canter on its own. Like that would really make sense, right? Or saying that I have to somehow figure out how to get this baby horse walk trot cantering and then I'm allowed to hire a trainer. It's not the right way of thinking about it. There's no threshold that you have to meet. I would encourage everyone to think of this as a set of skill that can be learned at any stage, that will benefit you at any stage, and will always accelerate your learning. They can help you learn more faster because they help you to remove obstacles to learning, like fear, low confidence, and nervous system challenges, like we've been talking about today.
So it kind of sounds like even if we're not working towards a show, like maybe what you're working on and working towards is your riding lesson or your pony club meetups. Like it doesn't have to be we're going to a five-star event to access these tools. It could be, hey, I get some performance anxiety when I go for my lesson and people are watching. Or it could be, I'm struggling to work through this thing in the arena that I have some previous associations with. Or I just want to maximize my learning because I flippin' love this sport and I
Yeah.
want to get as much out of it and have as much fun as possible. Like it sounds like it doesn't have to fit one category, is what I'm hearing.
I work with riders in particular across a huge range of things. Not all of my clients competitive riders by any stretch. There's lots of people who are using these tools to manage their fear, advance their training with their horse, help them to train young horses, helping them to overcome a challenge from the past, or just build more confidence, have more fun is another kind of great outcome often from utilizing these tools. So I would suggest a reframe. Reframe is where we restructure a belief to a version of the story that's more helpful to us and allows us to move forward instead of stopping us in our tracks. Often we can tell a belief is limiting if it stops us or shuts us down from learning or taking a next step with something. So in this case, I would reframe to make it about focused on the learning, right? So asking yourself the question, am I actively learning right now? And am I interested in accessing tools that support that learning? And that's very broad because then it kind of helps you see anyone who feels like they're actively learning or wanting to learn, improve in the sport, learn how to overcome something or excel at something more, then these tools will help. I have absolutely no doubt. And the great thing is that you can learn a lot in just a few sessions. So it's not actually a huge investment. It doesn't have to be years of partnering. I often work with people for, across 3 to 10 sessions and they get the tools that they need to then take them and run with them. So yeah, I would just encourage people to think about a reframe that helps them to think about, is this really something that I'm interested in? And to recognize that if their goal is about learning and moving forward, then absolutely these tools will help.
So, so cool. So I know, Annika, that we're getting on in the evening. So we probably, however, I want to talk to you for another 8 hours. I should probably not do that to you tonight. There will be other podcasts. I will have you back again. Can I ask you one more question?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing that I see a lot is clients with regular coaches, and their coaches have wonderful information to share, but maybe what they don't have is a very healthy way of sharing that information. That makes sense. So I know we've talked privately before about how people talk to us impacts how we're then talking to ourselves. I'm wondering, from your perspective, if people don't have an option to go with a different coach, or maybe they adore their coach, but they're struggling with how their coach speaks to them and how they then interpret information, is reframing a piece of how someone might deal with that, or is that totally different? This is a common issue that you see too, is it? Like coaches in our heads? Maybe that's a better way of putting it. Coaches in our heads.
Yeah. I think a lot of the time with sport coaches, their training is really focused on technical skill specific knowledge and then translating that knowledge to the next generation, shall we say. And how that actually happens is often really largely influenced by how they were coached. I see that a lot, right? So if they were coached in a kind of shouty, if you're not crying once a week, you're not learning kind of approach, shall we say, a little more old school, then it's likely that they will carry that through because that's just the way that they saw it done. And often, if they are coaching themselves, maybe it works for them to a degree, right? Or they manage to work with it. And so they see maybe that there's some value in that. So It's not uncommon to come up against a coach that has a style of coaching that is challenging. And as you say, maybe you still recognize that there's a lot to learn from them. Maybe you have a friendship with them outside of the coaching and it's just kind of the coaching part that's really hard. Maybe you don't have an option to seek out someone else. So part of the story that can keep us stuck in an unhealthy coach athlete relationship is the story that I don't have any power in this relationship. I have to just do what the coach tells me, and I have to just take whatever they throw my way, right? I can't advocate for myself. And that's an old story in sport, right? It's a story that has caused all sorts of problems in various sports over the years where athletes have felt disempowered and therefore unable to advocate for themselves or speak up when things aren't working for them. And it's a pattern, I think, that it's been pretty entrenched in a way in equestrian sport where there is kind of this norm of just like the coach's word is it. And we're very much conditioned to just follow that and not ask too many questions, not challenge, kind of do what we're told in a way. And it's not that that's all wrong. Like we are there to follow the coach's instructions. However, sometimes athletes don't realize that they have a voice in that relationship that they can use, right? Sometimes I like to reframe that, like, remember, your coach is your employee. You are paying them to do something for you, right? You can give your coach feedback. You can say, hey, when you do that, it makes me feel really scared or unconfident, right? Or if you shout your instructions at me, I find it hard to process what you're saying and really act on it. Any coach should be open to feedback. If your coach is completely unopen to feedback and unable to hear any feedback, then that actually speaks to a bigger challenge. And that may be that that person is actually very hard to work with moving forward. But I very rarely come up against a coach that's completely unable to hear feedback. Pretty much all the time when the people I work with start giving their coach feedback, a really cool things happens. The coach loves it. The coach is like, amazing. Tell me more about how I can better coach you, right? Because 9 times out of 10, the coach just wants to help you. And they're just doing it the best way that they know how or the way that they've seen at role models, right? So, yeah, most of the time the coach is like, amazing. Tell me more. Or maybe they don't take that positive reaction, but at least they're open to it and they're like, okay, cool. Yeah, sure. Like we can try it this way. Right. And that then leads to you kind of co creating a relationship, a coaching relationship that works better for you.
I love that answer. I love it. And for anyone listening, Annika and I had a couple of things we were going to chat about. And then I just have continuously continued to throw other things at dear Annika. And she has handled them all beautifully with the very clear, concise, knowledgeable answers that I would expect from Annika. Thanks, Annika.
Well, it's fun. It's good. So they're not unfamiliar topics, shall we say.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think on that, unless there's anything else that you would like to speak to before we finish up, I think we will call that good. And I'll just have to invite you on soon again so that I can throw more questions at you.
I would love that. Yeah, it's such a pleasure. I love our chats. And if anyone listening has questions or ideas about things that they would like to hear more about, please don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. And we always have lots to talk about, but we're happy to put your question to the top of our list.
I love that. I love that. Okay. Well, in that case, Annika, delight as usual. And I'll say that that's a wrap.
See you later.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. My goal is to share information with people that they may not have had access to. So please share this podcast around. Do all the things: rate, review, subscribe, donate. Let's keep this podcast going. And most important, go have fun with your horse. See you soon.